Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show here on the internet that brings you the libertarian, the pure, uncompromising libertarian perspective on the issues going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I thought we would address today a topic that, well, it's actually near and dear to the hearts of conservatives and not so much libertarians, although I think there are libertarians who support it, and that's the idea of school vouchers. It's an idea that has really taken the conservative movement by storm. It's their way of trying to get people saved from the public schooling system. But it's also an idea that you and I have been critical of in the whole 29 years that we've been running FFF. I think that FF has been running. You were here, of course, in the early days, and then you went on to become fee president, and now you're teaching at the Citadel. But we were addressing this topic from the very early days. In fact, I'll start out with a recollection that I have of, I forget what issue of Future of Freedom, which that time was called Freedom Daily, that you and I were addressing the educational issue. But it was in that first year, 1990. I think it was maybe the April issue, not really sure. But I wrote an article that was critical of vouchers, saying, this is just a socialist way to try to make public schooling work more efficiently. I mean, it's really a welfare program, as I stated there. You've got this whole public schooling structure that is really a socialist construct. That's why they have public schooling in Cuba and North Korea and other socialist countries. And so vouchers are really just another welfare state scheme. It's a scheme by which money is taken from wealthy people, middle class, and the poor too. They pay school taxes. And then the money is taken from one group of people in order to give it to another group of people, the needy, the ones that would like to get their kids out of the public school system and into private schools. So it's really based on the same socialist structure, taking money from those to whom it belongs in order to give it to people to whom it does not belong, that libertarians really condemn the whole welfare state idea, mandatory charity idea. And the argument was that that Milton Friedman, he was really one of the primary promoter of vouchers back in the 70s and 80s. That the idea was that, this is a way to phase out public schooling, and that was Friedman's argument that, hey, look, our objective is to get rid of state involvement in education. This is the way to do it, and so I wrote this article criticizing that it's really a way to make public schooling work more efficiently. And so it is today that voucher proponents very rarely say that their goal is to end public schooling. Their goal now is to make public schooling more efficient, and they say that vouchers will do that. Well, lo and behold, Friedman was reading our stuff, Richard, as you recall, and he levels this attack on me. And at the same time on Mises and on Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand, criticizing those of us that were uncompromising. And he says, this is just a way to phase out public schooling. Well, it wasn't. I mean, as we've learned, that vouchers have just made the state more involved, more embedded in education. They certainly put private schools under the control of the government because, if you're being subsidized by the government's going to regulate you. And we certainly haven't seen any phasing out taking place, if at all. I mean, you've got the government involved more heavily than ever in education. And like I said, the voucher proponents don't even make the argument anymore. And so I think the principle that you and I were enunciating early on, and other libertarians, that you've got to keep making the principal case for why the state has no legitimate role in education, and that settling for a program like vouchers is not going to get you what you want, It's just going to get you more state involvement in education.
Well, I think that I think part of the reason Friedman wanted this was that the intention was a reasonable one from the idea of the economist, and that is what improves the quality of something and what is tending to keep its price down. Market competition. So you have a situation where the government schools are in monopoly. You have to attend government schools. The funding comes through direct taxpayer collected revenues. The teachers are all the employers of the state, all but local district governments. And so how do you deal with a monopoly in terms of variety, better service, quality improvement, cost efficiency, competition? So therefore, Friedman came out with this idea that if we can't abolish public schools, at least force them to be more competitive by giving parents this voucher, some amount equivalent to what would be a hypothetical tax burden that they would have otherwise borne to send the school of the government's choice, and let this voucher follow the child around, and the parent then picks the school, and therefore the revenues that the schools gain is a reflection of how many parent customers they're successfully attracting, and that this will make it attractive for one set of schools to constantly try to do better, and the schools that are losing voucher revenues to realize that they're getting into financial problems and they need to get their act together. Now, all of this sounds reasonable on the surface. At one level of this, isn't competition better than monopoly? But what Friedman thought was going to be a stepping stone, gradualist approach to the final liberation of education from the state ended up being a snare that, in fact, loosened the degree of liberty, weakened the degree of liberty that private sector education had. Because you did have private schools, as you have today, that may take no government money. And while it's very difficult for any school, like kindergarten through 12th grade, to avoid all forms of government regulation, standards, benchmarks, curriculum requirements, and so on, a private school has a degree of greater latitude, a really private school, because they're just depending upon private tuition. But once you had either public schools or then private schools competing for these vouchers, then tax dollars are coming their way through the voucher. And then slowly but surely what happened is you had people saying, well, this is tax dollars going to these private schools. Now, therefore, if they're getting the people's revenue as part of their sources of money, isn't it appropriate that the government itself then see what is the curriculum, what are the standards and qualifications of the teachers, are certain social benchmarks being met as to how many students of different backgrounds are being accepted. And therefore, the spider's web of federal regulations that ensnared, to begin with, all public schools, because they are government schools, now began to envelop some private schools as well, until it's hard to be able to say that these private schools that receive the vouchers are really private anymore. Let me give one example. I have been a university or a college professor for many decades. So has my wife. I'm an economist. My wife is an historian. We always received high student evaluations. I have been tenured, which means you're evaluated that you show competency, qualifications to be a permanent faculty member, part of which is your effectiveness in the classroom. I can proudly say, and with humility, but proudly say, that I have sent some of my undergraduate students on to graduate school, and they have become successful in their careers. So I would certainly like to think, and admittedly I've taken my humility hat off slightly, I would like to think that I'm a qualified, competent teacher in the classroom. I cannot teach in a public school because I do not have the government's mandatory teacher education certification, which means you have to go through a bunch of government-approved teaching education classes. Or if you are a private school that receives vouchers, you're allowed a certain number of teachers who do not have such certificates, but in many states they can only teach for 1 or at the most 2 years before they have to get such a government teacher certification to be able to continue full time. So this itself has narrowed the pool of the potentially qualified and competent and energizing teaching staff that a true competitive educational environment would have. Now, there's also a whole array of other issues that go beyond the fact that the voucher system has, in fact, enveloped branches of private school within the spider's web of government educational controls, standards, benchmarks, and rules. There is the more fundamental question, is that, well, where does this money come from? It comes from tax dollars. It's not as if the government is actually giving you back some of your money in the form of voucher. It's general government revenues. There are people who have no children. There are some people whose children graduated from high school and college and are now pursuing careers of their own. There are people who are spending their own private dollars to send their children to private schools outside of a voucher network. But they, as well, see a compulsory redistribution of their wealth to support the vouchers of others who are eligible for those vouchers. And then those institutions receiving the vouchers are generating revenue from taxpayers who may not want that education, have no children in the system, and in fact may vehemently oppose the logic and the direction and the formats of such voucher receiving schools. That itself is a fundamental ethical problem with this. And then finally, I would just say is that this idea that it would be a stepping stone. You know, when we wrote those early articles, Jacob, and I know both of us at various times have either spoken or written about this as the years have gone by, part of our critique has been that rather than a road to educational freedom, this will in fact be a road to educational serfdom, where whatever private sector existed will in fact be undermined and reduced because of the very nature of the bureaucratic strings and requirements that come. And therefore, this is a dead end if you want real free education, not an avenue to its liberation.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of good points. Let me go back to just the basic libertarian framework here. I mean, we libertarians believe that you should be free to live your life any way you choose, so long as your conduct is peaceful. So no murder, rape, burglary, and so forth. But otherwise, you should be free in an economic sense to keep everything you earn and decide for yourself what to do with it. So whether you go to church or not, your business. Government doesn't exist to force you to go to church. Doesn't involve itself with religious activity. It's not a legitimate function of government. So we libertarians are always asking, what is a legitimate role of government in a free society? Drug laws. Drug laws play no role in a free society. You should be free to ingest whatever you want. It may be harmful, it may be destructive, you may be ending your life sooner than you ordinarily would. It's your business. Well, it's no different with respect to education. That education is in the same category as religion. That government has no role in education. This should be entirely left to the free market. Now, Richard, you and I both know that that's a shocking notion to people that are just getting exposed to libertarianism, that are hearing about it for the first time. I mean, the same thing happened with the drug war when we would bring up drug legalization, and we did in our Journal of Freedom Daily, Future of Freedom, back in the 90s. When we mentioned drug legalization, man, people went ballistic. But now, notice how times have changed. Now it's on the table. Now states are at least legalizing marijuana. They're talking about ending drug prohibition entirely. So it shows you the power of ideas. Well, it's the same with education. It's a shocking notion when a person first hears it. But in order for a person to consider an idea, he's got to hear the idea, he's got to see it. The likelihood of somebody coming up with the idea on their own is very, very small. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I see it's incumbent on us libertarians to not only raise the issue so that people can start thinking about it, even if they're shocked and abhor, shocked and abhor the idea initially, they have to hear the idea, they have to consider it in order for them to ultimately adopt it. And a lot of this happens in the process of discovering libertarianism, where you hear a libertarian position and you go, oh my God, no way. And then as you start thinking about it and digesting it and processing it, you think, okay, now I see the argument. Well, making the case for educational liberty is entirely different from making the case for vouchers. I mean, getting people to think about educational liberty, the separation of school and state, which is the title of one of our earlier books that Sheldon Richman did for us, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. It's taken after that motto of separating church and state, that we don't want government involvement. And making that case, Richard, for educational liberty, for the separation of school and state, is much more challenging, much more difficult than making the case for vouchers. Because vouchers naturally, except for Friedman, I mean, at least Friedman said, I'm favoring vouchers as a way to end government involvement in education. All right, I don't think he was right. I think he's been proven wrong. But at least he's there giving the goal line. The voucher proponent of today never talks about ending government involvement. He talks in terms of choice, giving people choice. Well, the choice they're giving them is no different from the choice of a thief. You know, a thief that goes out and steals somebody's money. He's got choices now. He just stole this $1,000. Look at all the choice he has with the $1,000 he's stolen. It's no different from any welfare program. You take money from one group of people and you give it to another group. The person that's now receiving it, he's got choices. So, I mean, if once you buy that argument, you've essentially said you support the whole welfare state concept. And so the arguments that are used for vouchers are totally different from the arguments that cause people to think at a more fundamental level. Why should government be involved in education in the first place? And that's one of my real beefs with the voucher movement. They don't cause people they don't challenge people to think at a higher level, a deeper level of why does the state need to be involved in education? Why not a total free market in education? Leaving parents free to direct the education of their children. Letting entrepreneurs vie for the business of consumers, the parents saying, hey, this is what we're offering you. And where parents are treating kids differently, because kids are different. Even within a family, they have different interests, different methods, different passions. And why that's the thing that you and I think other libertarians bring to the table. We're causing people to challenge the paradigm itself, while voucher proponents accept the paradigm and are trying to operate within it.
Well, I think a part of what you're bringing out, it was an interesting rationale, which was not Friedman's, because you're right. He said the goal is to basically privatize education. You know, what are the stepping stones that might be usable to get there? But I remember talking to a lot of libertarians and certainly conservatives decades ago when the voucher issue was first being proposed and then experimented with in some communities. I would make the same type of case that, you know, to these people, well, you obviously know what's wrong with the educational system from a variety of perspectives. Why don't you just call for the end of government schools, the end of compulsory state financed and schooling? And they would say, that might be a desirable goal, but the people are not ready for it. We have to sort of ease them in. Now, you see, if we set up a voucher program, then people will see that choice in education is good, and how, you know, competition gave them a chance for their kid to have a better educational background for the remainder of their lives. And then once that catches on, then we can sort of broaden the argument until we say, well, if it works with vouchers, why do we even need vouchers? But let's think about this. is that the case of freedom, stated explicitly and relatively completely, is unwinnable. The people will be frightened by it. People will not be open to it. People will be repelled to it. People are not ready for real freedom of choice. That is, no government involvement in these everyday affairs of themselves and their families. And that we will just ease them into this. Now, what is very interesting is that, as you were saying, if you talk to most proponents of school vouchers, school choice today, there are very few and far between who even mention anymore the idea of an end goal of the end to government involvement in education, the separation of school and state, if you will. Instead, this is the system they want. The idea is that, yes, everyone should be required to have an education, and it's only reasonable that it be funded from the general tax revenues of the community, because are there not positive externalities, to use a phrase? We all have a better society if each member has received a reasonable and basic education and as a stepping stone if they decide to go on to college. But what we want to do is we just wanted to have the vibrancy, the innovativeness that we know that comes with competition, to break this monopoly of the teachers' unions with their own agendas, with their own ideologies, the wastefulness, when no one feels they're going to lose revenue if they have no competitors. But what was to be a means to a final end, the separation of government from the educational process, has become the end itself. So now, not only has it had the problems that I mentioned, once tax dollars go somewhere, the regulations invariably and the controls invariably follow. There's the fact that there is no end game. The means are the end. And if they could just have voucher schools, both public and private, funded through general tax revenues through a voucher method, I think most school choice people would consider they now had education in a free society.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, here's the original argument as Friedman was proposing it, as you point out, that we want educational liberty, and Friedman said in this article that was reprinted in Liberty magazine at the time and that is online. I forget the name of it, but he says to get from here to there, we have to have vouchers. Now that was fallacious, but the point is that at least he was looking at it as his goal. And the fact is that that's never happened. I mean, you've had vouchers, I think, in Milwaukee for 30 years or something like that, and nobody's ever talking about, well, it's time that the phase out has now begun. Nobody talks like that. I mean, how long does it take this phase out to begin? And it's logical, Richard, that people would resist it, because let's say you've got a private school that is taking vouchers and has been for 30 years. Let's say $500,000 of their budget is based on voucher income. So they've expanded the school, they've built classrooms to accommodate all these kids that are coming in on vouchers, they've hired teachers. What are the chances that school is suddenly going to say, well, we think it's time to phase out the vouchers? The phase out has now begun. I mean, you know, after 30 years, if it hasn't been phased out, that's a pretty good possibility that it's not going to be phased out. And here, the recipient of the welfare is, how likely is it going to be saying, well, yeah, we're ready to end government involvement in education? It's not going to happen. Now, you raised the other thing about method. I mean, how do you reach from there? And this is what Friedman missed. You know, Friedman says, how do you get from here to there in this article where he was criticizing me and Mises and Ayn Rand? He says, well, you get from here to there through vouchers. Nonsense. In fact, he even suggested that's the only way. He implicitly suggested that. But there's another way, as you point out. All you have to do is repeal compulsory attendance laws, you know, the laws that require parents to submit their children to a state-approved education. 2, repeal all school taxes. So all you got to do is just repeal the school taxes. Get rid of the school buildings. Sell them off, donate them to private institutions or whatever. those three things would end government involvement in education, or get rid of the licensure laws also in private schools. So that way, that's the way you end government involvement in education. This is what Friedman didn't seem to grasp, that you don't need to phase out government involvement in education. All you got to do is end government involvement in education. Now, again, that's the challenge, is how do you get people to start thinking about that? And if we libertarians who believe in free markets, who know that the free market system produces the best of everything, if we're not going to call for educational liberty, we're not going to call for free markets in education, who is? I mean, it's incumbent on us who have studied it, who have processed it and digested it, and who believe and who have faith in the free market to lead the way by making the case, because that's the only way that's going to get other people to start thinking about the issue. And then once they start thinking about the issue, not everyone comes around, but that's the only way that people can come around, is if they start hearing and thinking about it. That's how we've made all this progress on the drug war, for example, because people were shocked in the beginning, but now more and more people have thought about it, digested it, processed it, and now we're getting very close, I think, to pushing that program over the precipice. But it becomes, we get to that point because people are over there talking about the idea rather than settling for some kind of reform that assumes the continued existence of the program.
Right. You know, the analogy about, you know, the method can be taken from two great reform movements, by which I mean classical liberal reform movements of the 19th century, slavery and free trade. Now, if you talk to the proponents of ending slavery, they all said, what is, you know, what you do is you have no more slaves. So one man may not own another. But they didn't say, well, let's sort of have government vouchers for slaves, you know, and then you know, somehow this will make it, you know, nicer for the slaves. No, they said our goal is the abolition of slavery. Now, we admit that there are a lot of pro-slavery people, and it's not going to go overnight. But how can we institute at least repeals here and there that are leading that direction? Or what can we do as private individuals that will alleviate the problem? Let's think of the free trade movement. British advocates of free trade like Richard Cobden and John Bright, they called for absolute universal free trade. And for Britain, in fact, to just do it unilaterally, not even wait for reciprocal trade barrier agreements being lowered among countries. And they said that that was their goal. But they realized that legislatively, you may only be able to get rid of these tariffs first and lower some of those. But it was all in the direction of not more managed trade, but reducing or abolishing parts of it so that you're taking the bricks away from the building so that eventually, if you can't blow up the building all at once, the building is not going to stand anymore. And then, of course, finally, they had this big food crisis because of famines, and they ended all of the agricultural protectionism in one piece of legislation like that in June of 1846. But that was their idea, that you don't say tinker with the existing system. You call for its ending and then just pull bricks out of the building to be demolishing the building if you can't bring it all down at once. The voucher system was not saying, well, let's first end, you know, licensing so the private schools don't have to be bothered with that. And then let's introduce more deregulation of whatever curriculum and other restrictions were on private schools. So at least we're doing that. That would have been freeing each of these things up, even if incrementally, with the private sector having more freedom than they had before, with the goal of all education being free. If you see the analogy I'm making, they didn't do that. What they did is they said, well, we're going to make the system freer by tying government revenues to a wider ambit of private schools and then ensnaring them in rules, regulations, and as you correctly say, hooking private schools on the government voucher revenue gravy train, where once those private schools are themselves receiving government revenues through the voucher system, why would they ever want to end this? How could they be sure that they would continue to prosper, be profitable, successful in a truly open, competitive, non-governmental arena of schooling and education? So better to stay with the voucher system which guarantees us a stream of revenue through tax dollars than the uncertainty of the wilds of a really free market.
Yeah, I think those two analogies are fantastic on trade, but especially on slavery. I mean, you could imagine voucher proponents in the Old South saying, "Hey, look, we can have a voucher program that removes some of the slaves, maybe the young slaves, and puts them over on a nicer plantation, and makes life a little bit better for them." Or you could even imagine people that devoted their lives to improving the lives of the slaves, like shorter working hours, better health care, better food, better nutrition on the plantation. All of which we can concede would make life better for the slaves. But my juices don't get going on any of those things. I mean, to me, slavery is so abhorrent that my mind doesn't even go to that point. I want slavery ended. I want to devote my life to abolishing it. And in order to do that, you've got to make the case for ending slavery. If
Right.
all you do is settle for making life better for the slaves on the plantation, then the likelihood is that there's going to be more people not thinking at that deeper level of why should there even be slavery. And
Right.
so it's incumbent on those of us that know better to sit there and say, end the slavery. And even for people that want to make life better for the slaves, seems to me that we're all better off if while they're doing that, they're making the case for why slavery should be ended. And it's no different with respect to education. Is that we in order to get this horrible system that is so destructive. I mean, we haven't even talked about how public schooling really destroys people's mindsets. This thirst for learning that every kid has, this regimentation, this conformity. That it's really, I consider public schooling Army light. I mean, it's really the way a person who is drafted into the military is treated in public schooling. They're trying to get your mind right. They're molding your mind for those 12 long years, and it's so destructive that what it does to children and their passion for learning, that we need to end government involvement. But in order to do that, you got to make the case for ending this thing, just as the opponent of slavery would make the case for ending slavery, and just as the proposer, the advocate of free trade, would make the principal case for ending all government involvement in trade.
Right, absolutely.
So, okay, on that note, we'll wrap it up. We're out of time. It was great to see y'all again. And if you want to know more about this issue, come to our website at fff.org. We have this fantastic book. It was written many years ago by Sheldon Richman, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Family. But like most of our work here at FFF, the principles are timeless. If you haven't read that book, it's really worth reading today. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Richard, and I'll see you next week.
Till next week, and thank you again to our viewers and listeners for giving us a little bit of their time.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org, and we'll see you next week.